The very first major civilization in the Americas is known as Olmec civilization. This civilization occurs in the Gulf Coast of Mexico. When we speak of Mexico, however, you must get it very clear in your mind that we're not speaking of the shrunken Mexico of today. We speak of Mexico when it was the very core and heartland of Native American civilizations. A Mexico that included parts of Colorado, parts of Texas, parts of California, going right up to La Plata in Canada. This civilization, known as Olmec, was to touch all other civilizations in America. The Maya, the Toltec, the Aztec, etc. It was even to stretch right out into South America. What is very unusual about this civilization was that not only was it the mother of American civilizations, but it contained elements that were not just native to America, but was a fusion between the Native American and people coming from outside. The most significant of those outsiders were the Africans. We have very clear evidence in stone heads, in terracottas that are clay sculptures, as well as skulls and skeletons of an African physical type entering that native population, somewhere between 948 and 680 BC. How do we know the date? It is because on one of the platforms in the holy center and capital of the Olmec world, a place called La Venta, we were able to date the stone heads because they were rooted in a wooden platform where the Americans worshipped, and we got this dating of 948 to 680 BC. Now, several people have wondered what kind of Africans these were. Who were these outsiders? These were largely Egypto-Nubian types. At least that type was in command. Because what we do find in the evidence is that not merely the presence of this physical type, which is African, but the presence of cultural elements, which we will talk about in this program, which are clearly of Egypto-Nubian origin. The question arises, why do we include Egypt among classical African civilizations? There is now absolutely no doubt that the ancient Egyptian civilization was overwhelmingly African. They have found the kingdom of Ta-Seti in the Nile Valley, where all the major elements, political and religious elements, spring out of the south of Egypt, spring out of the Nubian world at Custal in Nubia, where we have about a dozen black kings reigning before the first Egyptian dynasty. Even the hieroglyphs, the writing system of the Egyptians, we find they have their roots in the Sudan, so that as the Africans move up from Nubia, they go into Egypt, so that we find the African not only in the evening of Egyptian civilization, but in its very dawn. And we find them also in the noon dynasties. This is very important because it's important to understand that the Egyptian thing, the Egyptian miracle, was not only to touch Europe, not only to touch Asia, but was to stretch out to America as well, etc. They were absolutely convinced that there were Africans in America at some ancient time. Why were they convinced? They were convinced by two things. By the African physiognomy, the dome of the forehead, the cut of the nose, the jaw, the mouth, etc., but also by something which has never been mentioned in the archaeology for some odd reason. And that is, at the back of the stone head, there was hair, detailed Ethiopian type hair. No Native American has hair like that. And if that was presented in the archaeology, all this nonsense about babies and jaguars, I have never seen a jaguar with hair like that. And I've never seen a baby with a face like that. People had to find explanations for things they found embarrassing. It is similar to the discovery of the great civilization of Ta-Seti, the kingdom rather of Ta-Seti in the Nile Valley, which precedes the Egyptian. The man who found the Ta-Seti, Keith Seal, never said a word about it. He died without saying anything. And it was left to Bruce Williams, who many of us will hear in Atlanta in September. It was left to Bruce Williams, his student, to take it out to the back rooms of the University of Chicago Oriental Institute and present it to the world. They said the reason why they delayed so long is because it took 15 years to put the pieces together. Without all those pieces, the stoneware vessels, etc., the pottery that was found, the stone incense burner at the site of Tarseti at Kustal, the site of Kustal, did not need putting together. It was intact from the very beginning. What needed to be put together were their heads. And that was not put together until the head who had a right to put it together died. Thank God. It is absolutely important for us to take a very serious view of this, because we find again and again and again that you have a deliberate effort to wipe out the evidence, to hide it, to explain it away. Why is it that this photograph, even now, I am not permitted to use that until 1985, because it involves a whole series of things. But why is it that this head is not among the heads at Villa Hermosa, is not among the heads in the National Geographic or the Smithsonian or any traveling circus of Olmec heads? It is hidden at Tuxtla, where nobody goes. It's very important to note that that was the first head found, and it had a profound effect, although it was the only thing found at that time that indicated an African influence. It was left to the expeditions of 1938 and 1939, expeditions carried out jointly by the Smithsonian Institute, the University of California, and the National Geographic, before they found more of these stone heads. They recovered the one at Tres Zapotes, and then they went on the next year in 1939. They went on to La Venta, and then they found 4 of these stone heads. They also found, and many of you have noted this in the museum at Villa Hermosa, at La Venta Park, you have noted the plan of the city. I want you to look at that plan carefully. There is the first pyramid in America. There is the first step pyramid. There are the arms of the village. And on those arms stand the great stone heads facing the Atlantic Ocean. This is in the Gulf of Mexico. This is at the point which on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico where you find the terminus of the Atlantic currents from Africa. Because the currents from Africa take you to northeastern South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico, swinging towards Florida. And then if you are lucky, if you learn as the Africans were later to learn, perhaps not at this period, you can find a circular current that takes you back towards Europe and Africa. Here at La Venta, they began to see a distinctive art style. Here at La Venta, they began to see something in the faces of the monuments, something in the traits, the cultural traits of the Olmec that was to leave its stamp on later civilizations like the Maya, out in Palenque, out in Monte Alban, out in Mitla, even in the evening, the twilight of the gods at Teotihuacan, out at Tatilco, at Cerro de las Misas, in the Monte Alban phase. All of these are branches coming out of the mother culture, the Olmec. And there's something very distinctive. Here, for the first time at La Venta, are the pyramids. Here, for the very first time, is found the sarcophagus, like in Egypt. Here, for the very first time, are monumental stelae and sculptures of colossal proportions. Here, for the very first time, are the great priest-kings. Here, for the very first time, are enormous ceremonial temples and altars built to the gods. Some things must be said about the stone heads which you must note. There is one of them that has a tube running from the ear out of the mouth, which was featured as an oracle, and it has a flat top which functioned as an altar. This is very important because it is that kind of oracular thing that was found in Egypto-Nubian the period. In order for the priest kings of the Egyptians to hold the world together, which was being torn apart. The Bible describes Egypt at that time like it describes the great factions and frictions in Egypt at that time. They speak of it as some sort of a torn nation. And in order to pull it together, they had to find once again the power of religion. Religion is responsible for the extraordinary vitality that built the temples and the pyramids and the great tombs of both Egypt and America. Note that. People do not do those extraordinary things. Only giants could do those things. Man becomes a giant when he develops a peculiar kind of focus, when there's a crystallization of his psychic energy. In civilizations that are highly fragmented, that have lost all their certitudes and cannot find again any kind of certitude and focus and power, the tremendous capacity to have the consciousness to operate as a giant is lost. Only giants can build those things. It has nothing to do with size, because the American is small in size. It has nothing to do with machines, because the Egyptian machines were crude compared to the machines we have today. It has to do with a peculiar kind of consciousness which made it possible for one to do things so monumental that even we now, with our great machines, cannot attempt to do what the Africans did. It is so extraordinary that just a few years ago, the American government sent out a team to study how the Egyptians moved heavy objects across the sand. And in spite of all of our technology, when one of the great nuclear things, nuclear reactors were being moved across the deserts at Gary, they used the identical method the ancient Egyptians used. This is the high technology, the 20th century, looking for a method that was the most practical and efficient method for moving a heavy object across the sands. So you're not dealing here with primitives, in spite of the ancient nature, in spite of the time, the prehistoric time of these cultures and civilizations. You're dealing with highly sophisticated people, a state of mind, a consciousness that made it possible for this extraordinary leap to occur. And the peculiar thing about the Olmec is that that leap occurs with all the Egyptian elements in it. It had its own native elements. It had its jaguar. The jaguar is not Egyptian. Nobody in Egypt or Nubia has a jaguar that they worship. There's a little cat cult in Nubia which I noted, but it's not equivalent at all to the great jaguar which prowled the swamps of the Olmec. Why then suddenly they start with things which are duplicated nowhere else in the world in such a complex, in such a combination, in such an arbitrary combination? The stelae with the hieroglyphs, the monumental sculpture, the sarcophagus, the pyramids, the step and the true pyramid, and all of these elements, even including, as I have shown, the bird and the serpent on the crown of the Egyptians and the Olmec, and all of the monarchic traits, a whole series of monarchic traits that distinguish royalty in the Olmec world and in the Egyptian world. Clearly, we have evidence of some kind of body of people who came into the Olmec world at that time. And there is a reason for this, because people have asked, okay, fine. All right, people can cross the Atlantic, fine. You have proven they have boats, fine. But why did they come here? The Egyptians have no business in the Atlantic, which is true. The Egyptians have no business in the Atlantic. The Atlantic is very, very far from Egypt. And Egyptian ships have no right in the Atlantic circa 800 BC. The reason why they are in the Atlantic at all, in the North Atlantic, is because of an unusual situation that is occurring in the Mediterranean at that point in time. It is very important, therefore, not only to study what was happening in Mesoamerica, but to study what was happening at that point in time in Egypt and Nubia. What you have is a war going on between Africa and Asia. The Asiatics are attacking everyone in the Mediterranean. They have smashed the Hittites. They have taken iron smelting process from the Hittites. They have smashed the Phoenicians. They have made vassals of the Phoenicians who have always been servants of the Egyptians and the Nubians. 50% of the Egypto-Nubian navies are Phoenician. These are people who, Sheikh Anta claims, were once black, who, like the Arabs who were once totally black in Saudi Arabia, became mixed with Asiatics, and you get this what you call the Semitic type. So that you have a mixed type Phoenician, which it gets black again as it enters North Africa and begins to intermingle once again with black people, until by the time of Hannibal, the Phoenician or Punic type is African. This type is restless up and down the Mediterranean. It has its cities at Tyre and Sidon, its great ports, but it's restlessly moving up and down the Mediterranean. And because the Asiatics block the seaports to the Indian Ocean, block the seaports to the Pacific, and we do have evidence of the Egyptians in the Pacific. We have Egyptian script found in Hawaii. These guys are ranging far out. Nothing stops the Egyptian. Wherever you go, you find him. I have found him in Spain. They have Egyptian villages in Spain, where Barifel has shown the cartouches of the Libyan kings around 1000 BC are found at Almunecar, Spain. And that runs right through the Spanish mention in their early chronicles that Taharqa, the Nubian general who is later to become the king of Nubia and Egypt, enters Spain with a garrison, so that the Africans are already in Europe. They're invading. They come in with a garrison into Spain, and then they retreat back because they have their own problems at home. So that we have evidence of movements in the direction west of the Mediterranean towards Africa, towards that part of Africa. And more fleets were driven, both military as well as commercial fleets were driven west of the Mediterranean, because tin was needed for the bronze armies, because this was the late Bronze Age. Copper was needed in Cyprus, tin was needed. They went right up into the British Isles and the North Atlantic searching for tin. And around 600 BC we have the Phoenicians going from Ezion Geber and going right down and coming right across Africa, right round Africa, right back into the Mediterranean. The Europeans did not go into the Atlantic because the Europeans were terrified of the Atlantic. The Europeans spoke of the Straits of Gibraltar as if there were monsters in the sea. They did not attempt any movement in that area. But the Phoenicians did, and they were very much tied up, as I say, with African navies. That is the reason why many of the great heads have military helmets. Not all of them do, but they're distinguished by military helmets. They are a warrior dynasty, because this is a period of war. For nearly 200 years, the world is in a state of war, as we are. Since the 1930s right up to the 1980s, every major army in the world has been ready to fight. We are in that state in which both the Africans and the Asiatics were. We cannot relinquish that state in this century until there actually is a war, which God forbid. But we cannot relinquish that state. All armies are armed to the teeth in the 20th century world. Regardless of whether you go down into Latin America, whether you go into the Caribbean, whether you go into Africa, whether you go to Israel, whether you go into Russia, whether you go through Eastern Europe, every army on earth now is armed to the teeth, ready and waiting for the conflagration, which, pray God, may never come. But that was the state of the world, where Therefore, a warrior dynasty appears with the great helmets. The warrior dynasty appears among the Olmec, carrying all of these elements. You find that apart from the stone heads which we have seen, we see cultural traits which I have mentioned, and then we go on to see, as I have also mentioned, that when the Olmec move out of Levanta and they send parts of their elite out at Tlatilco, at Cerro de las Misas, and at Monte Alban, when they study the skeletal evidence right in this territory at Monte Alban, when they go to the graves in this very part of Mexico, in Oaxaca, when they go to the graves of Monte Alban and they look at the ruling class, not the common people. The common people have nothing to do with it. The common people are Zapotec, later they're Mixtec, etc. But the ruling class, when they go into the graveyards, 4.5% of the ruling class here at Monte Alban is African. As much as 13.5% at Tlatilco is African. They're not in the common graves, and you can tell because side by side with the native, you're finding a different nose bridge, which remains in skeletal evidence. There's a ridge, there is a nasal index, there is a brow ridge, there are structures of the jaw, there are lengths of the arm. The African arm is different